The hospital hallway smelled like bleach and panic. Pale, clinical light buzzed overhead, flickering like it too was unsure if it could survive the night. Michaela stood at the threshold of room 317, her hands clenched into fists so tight her nails cut half-moons into her palms. Her mother's breathing on the other side of the door was erratic, shallow, and slow. She hadn't opened her eyes in 2 days. The doctor said it was only a matter of hours now, and Michaela hated God for it. Not in the abstract, not like someone frustrated with a traffic jam or a test result. This was not theological unease. This was fury. Wild, white-hot, soul-burning rage directed at the Almighty. The kind of anger that didn't come with screaming but with a deep, bone-dragging silence. Her lips didn't move. Her soul howled instead. How could you? She didn't ask for perfection. She didn't ask for prosperity. She asked for one thing, for her mother to make it through this. One prayer, one whisper. She didn't even ask loudly. And still, silence. Heaven was silent. The machines in the room beeped in a rhythm she would later remember in nightmares. Each tone announced her mother's fading heartbeat like a cruel metronome counting down to an ending she wasn't ready to write. A nurse brushed past her, murmuring a polite, "Excuse me," as if they were in a grocery aisle rather than standing at the crumbling edge of someone's entire world. Michaela finally stepped in. Her mother's hand felt like tissue, light, thin, almost unconnected to the rest of her. Her body was bloated from medication, yet somehow so fragile it felt like she would disappear the moment Michaela let go. A lump rose in her throat, but she didn't cry. She had no tears left. Not since that night, 2 weeks ago, when she dropped to her knees in her apartment and screamed at the ceiling for God to show up. He hadn't. She sat beside the bed, her fingers clutching the cross necklace her mom had given her on her 16th birthday. Back then, it had felt like a promise. Now, it felt like a lie. She almost yanked it off her neck, but stopped. Not out of reverence, out of exhaustion. "Do you even hear me?" she whispered. No answer, just the beep, the beep, the beep. The next morning, Michaela signed the paperwork. Her mother was gone. The funeral was 3 days later. Closed casket, white lilies. A priest who mispronounced her mother's name twice and quoted a verse Michaela hadn't heard since childhood. She sat stiff in the front row, gripping the folded obituary like it might contain a map out of her grief. People offered hugs. Some brought casseroles. One elderly woman patted her hand and said, "God must have needed her more than we did." Michaela stared at her blankly. Then she got up and walked out of the church. She walked until her feet blistered, until the sky darkened and her breath puffed white in the autumn air. She didn't care. She found herself at the pier, the place she and her mom used to go every summer. Tourists were gone now. The benches were empty. The water looked cold and cruel, just like her heart felt. She sat, opened her mouth to pray, and couldn't. How do you talk to someone who's ghosted you? The days that followed blurred. She went through the motions, coffee, work, fake smiles, and moments in bathroom stalls where she nearly collapsed under the weight of it all. She tried once, just once, to open her Bible. It felt heavy in her hands, alien. She flipped it open at random and landed on the Book of Job. She slammed it shut and threw it across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud and slid to the floor, open-faced like a body. That night, she had a dream. She was underwater, deep, suffocating. Above her, light rippled through the waves, unreachable. She kicked and thrashed, but her limbs moved slow like the water resisted her grief. Just as she started to sink, too tired to keep fighting, someone touched her hand. She turned, but there was no face, just warmth. She woke up in tears. 1 week later, Michaela stood in her mother's apartment sorting through her things. A chore she'd been avoiding. Every drawer was a graveyard. Every shelf held ghosts. In the back of her mother's closet, she found a shoebox tied with a red ribbon. Inside were letters, hundreds of them, addressed to her. None had been sent. The one on top was dated 3 years ago. She opened it with shaking hands. "My dearest Michaela, I know you're angry at God sometimes. I was too once. but I've learned something I hope you'll understand one day. Silence doesn't mean absence. Some of the most sacred things grow in the dark. Love always, Mom." Her breath caught. What did that mean? How could she know? She flipped through the rest. Dozens were filled with advice, love, prayers she didn't know had ever been prayed for her. Every page bled hope, and everyone was written to a daughter too angry to hear them. Michaela dropped the letter. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, sobbing into the empty air. That night, she found herself outside the old church. She didn't remember walking there. She didn't plan it. But there it was. The red door, the stained glass, the steeple cutting through the dark like a question mark etched in shadow. It was locked. She sat on the stone steps instead, the night chill biting through her jacket. She wanted to scream. "You let her die," she finally whispered. "You let her suffer. You sat up there and watched while I begged you." Her voice cracked. She covered her face with her hands. "I hate you for this." Silence. A minute passed, then 2, then 5. In the stillness, something stirred. Not a voice, not a presence, but a memory. Her mom, years ago. Sitting on the porch, rocking gently and whispering Psalm 34 under her breath. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted." She didn't finish the verse back then, but now the rest came back like breath after drowning. "And saves those who are crushed in spirit." Michaela's lips trembled. The anger was still there, so was the silence, but the verse echoed louder. She stood and walked home in the dark. A week later, she found another letter. It was tucked into the back of her mother's Bible. This one wasn't dated. It wasn't even addressed to her. "If I don't make it, tell Michaela she's stronger than she thinks. And tell her, God hears her even when he's silent. Especially then." I believe that. And so should she. It was signed simply, M. Her mother's name was Maria. Michaela read it 3 times before she dropped the Bible, unable to breathe. The silence she had been raging against wasn't empty. It was full of love she hadn't been ready to hear. There is a kind of grief that doesn't scream. It moves like fog, low, creeping, thick. It blurs time. Michaela couldn't remember what day it was. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed. She couldn't remember how it felt to breathe without it hurting. In the weeks following her mother's funeral, she did everything the world expected of her. She went to work, responded to emails, paid her bills, washed her dishes. But inside, she was hollow. Functioning grief looked convincing on her. Everyone thought she was holding up well. But they didn't see the nights. They didn't see her standing in the kitchen at 2:14 a.m. with the refrigerator door open, not looking for food, but just needing something, anything, to fill the silence. They didn't see the way she'd stare at her ceiling for hours, blinking in the dark, unable to remember what hope had ever felt like. They didn't see her avoiding her Bible like it was radioactive. She tried. Once. After finding her mother's letters, Michaela sat on her bed with the Bible resting on her lap, unopened. She stared at it, touched the edge, felt the guilt already forming. Then she shoved it back into the drawer. "Not yet," she whispered. It wasn't that she didn't believe anymore. It was worse. She didn't feel anything at all. There was no fire, no hatred, no desperate prayers. Just silence, inside and out. Her apartment had become a museum of memory. Her mother's scarf still hung by the coat rack. A voicemail from her father, dead 5 years now, remained saved on her phone. Dishes stayed in the sink a little longer each day. She stopped answering calls from friends. She stopped checking her church group chat. She muted everything but Spotify, which she used only to play ambient rain sounds so the silence didn't feel so loud. She was a ghost in her own life. At work, she smiled at her boss and nodded in meetings. She typed, responded, processed, calculated, filed. No one noticed when she forgot to eat lunch. No one noticed when she left early and cried in her car. No one noticed when she sat in the parking lot of the grocery store for 45 minutes and never went inside. Michaela had perfected the art of being fine. She hated it. One night, something broke. She was brushing her teeth, another numb ritual, when she looked in the mirror and didn't recognize herself. Not in the usual, "I've aged" way, but in the "I've disappeared" way. Her face was pale. Her eyes looked vacant. Her shoulders slumped like she was carrying someone else's sadness. She rinsed the toothbrush, and without planning to, whispered, "Are you even real?" She stared into the mirror. No answer. Just silence. She began dreaming more often. Always the same theme: water, sometimes a flood, sometimes drowning, sometimes walking through a foggy field with puddles at her feet. In one dream, she was waist-deep in black water and saw someone standing on the shore. She called out. The figure didn't move, just watched. She woke up soaked in sweat. Then came the post office. It was a rainy Thursday. She was mailing one of her mother's insurance forms. As she waited in line, she noticed a woman behind her, a small elderly woman with a lavender cardigan and a paper-wrapped package under one arm. The woman leaned forward and said, "You look tired, dear." Michaela offered a polite smile. "Long week." The woman nodded and then added quietly, "Even Jesus wept." Michaela froze. She turned. "Sorry?" The woman smiled, as if she hadn't said anything unusual. "Nothing, dear. Lovely weather, isn't it?" She stepped forward in line, humming softly. Michaela stood still for a long moment. Even Jesus wept. That night, Michaela finally picked up her Bible. She didn't open it. She just held it. She held it like someone clinging to a lifeboat they didn't believe would float. She sat with it in silence. Minutes passed, then hours. The morning sun crept in through her blinds, and she hadn't moved. The numbness didn't go away overnight. In fact, it got worse before it got better. She started writing letters to her mom, not because she believed she'd read them, but because she had no one else to talk to. The first letter was angry. The second, desperate. The third, quiet. In one letter she wrote, "I don't think God speaks anymore. I think I used to believe he did. But now, I just hear my own voice bouncing back at me. If silence is a language, it's the only one he uses." She mailed it, addressed to her mother's old house. She knew it would never be delivered. That wasn't the point. One Sunday morning, weeks later, Michaela woke up to the sound of birds. She hadn't heard them in a while. She walked to the window. The sky was streaked in pale pink and gold. The world looked softer. She didn't smile, but she didn't cry either. She just stood there, breathing. That afternoon, she decided to go for a walk. She hadn't in months. She ended up on the other side of town, somewhere unfamiliar. There was an old bench beneath a maple tree, leaves falling around it like confetti. She sat. There was a plaque on the bench. It read, "In memory of Sarah Ann, Psalm 46:1. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble." She didn't know who Sarah Ann was, but the verse hit her like a quiet wind. She sat there for over an hour, said nothing, heard nothing, but felt something. That evening she opened her Bible. It fell open to Lamentations 3. Her eyes landed on verse 26. "It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord." Her breath caught. She didn't understand it, but it stayed with her. That night she dreamt of the ocean again, but this time she wasn't drowning. She was floating, still tired, but floating. 2 days later, she went back to her church. It was empty, midweek. She sat in the back pew. She didn't pray. She didn't sing. She just sat. And for the first time in months, she whispered, "If you're here, I want to know you're here." The silence came again, but it felt different. Not empty, still. Like waiting in the wings of something sacred. Later that week, she found a letter in her mailbox. No return address. Just her name in handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It read, "You're not invisible. You're not alone. God isn't gone. He's just working in the quiet. A friend who's been there too. Michaela sat on her couch and wept. Not angry tears, not bitter tears. Just the kind of tears that come when the ice begins to crack. She still didn't have answers, but now she had a direction. She was at her desk, sorting invoices and ignoring the blinking notification light on her phone. She hadn't been answering unknown numbers lately. Ever since her mom passed, the idea of hearing another voice say, "I'm sorry for your loss," made her physically sick. But this one wasn't unknown. It was her Aunt Rena, her mom's sister. They hadn't spoken in nearly a year. Not since that argument at Christmas, the one where Michaela stormed out after Rena said she needed to start trusting God again. She answered on instinct. "Hello?" The line crackled. "Michaela," the voice said gently. "I'm cleaning out the house." Silence. "You should come. There are some things you'll want to see." 3 days later, Michaela stood at the edge of her childhood home. The porch was smaller than she remembered, the paint more chipped, the garden overgrown, but it smelled the same, like rosemary and thyme and something she couldn't quite name. Inside, the walls echoed. Furniture was pushed to the corners. Cardboard boxes lined the floor, labeled with black marker. Books, kitchen, linens, memories. She walked slowly through the living room, her fingers grazing the faded floral fabric of the couch where her mother used to sit with her Bible, her tea, her ever-present journal. She walked past the fireplace where they'd once hung stockings, past the staircase that led to the room that used to be hers. Everything felt smaller now, except the pain. That was larger than ever. In the kitchen, Rena stood at the counter, sorting through photographs. She looked up as Michaela entered. "You came." "I didn't think I would," Michaela admitted. Rena smiled, tired but sincere. "Grief doesn't play fair. It pulls us where it wants." They worked in silence for a while, sorting photos into piles. Every now and then, Rena would say something like, "Remember this day?" Or, "She loved that sweater." Michaela nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. There was something she needed to find. She didn't know what, but she could feel it, pulling her deeper into the house, deeper into memory. She climbed the stairs alone. Her old bedroom hadn't changed much. The wallpaper still peeled in the corner where she used to tape up posters. The mirror still had the chip from when she'd dropped her curling iron sophomore year. The bookshelf still leaned slightly to the left. She sat on the bed and stared at the closet door. That was where her mother kept the old trunk. She stood, crossed the room, and opened the door. There it was, the same trunk. Dusty, heavy, blue. She knelt, unlatched it, and lifted the lid. Inside were notebooks, dozens of them. Her mother's journals. Michaela picked one at random and opened to the middle. March 18th. Michaela hasn't spoken to me in 3 days. I think she's hurting more than she lets on. She snapped at me when I mentioned prayer again. Said she was tired of pretending God was listening. I wanted to snap back, but I didn't, because I've been there. I remember what silence feels like. I remember asking God why he was so cruel. I remember the night I buried my husband and cursed the sky, but I also remember what came after. I remember the whisper. I hope she hears it one day too. Michaela closed the journal and held it to her chest. She couldn't breathe. She spent the rest of the day reading, entry after entry, grief, faith, silence, hope. Her mother had written it all. She had written about God's quiet, about how unbearable it felt at times, about how it wasn't always punishment. Sometimes it was preparation. One entry read, "God doesn't always show up the way we want, but he always shows up the way we need." Another, "I used to think silence meant he was angry. Now I think it's when he's sitting the closest." Sometimes a parent doesn't answer a child's tantrum. They just hold them. Michaela broke. For the first time since the funeral, she prayed. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't even coherent. It was weeping, and whispering, and a long, agonizing silence between two hearts that had been estranged. "Where were you?" she whispered. "Why didn't you say anything?" No voice answered. But she felt something shift, not in the room, inside her. That night she dreamed again. She stood in a vast, dry field. The wind was still, the sky overcast, the ground cracked beneath her feet. She walked for what felt like hours. Then she saw him, a man seated on a stone. He didn't speak. She didn't either. She just sat beside him. And for the first time in all her dreams, she wasn't afraid. She woke up with tears in her eyes and a strange peace in her chest. The next day, she told Rena she needed to visit her father's grave. It had been years. The last time she was there, she was 16 and angry at the world for taking him so young. She hadn't prayed. She hadn't cried. She had just stared at the headstone and promised herself she'd never trust anyone again. Now standing before it again, she felt the weight of every unspoken word. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I blamed you. I blamed God. I blamed everyone but myself." She sat on the grass. "I didn't know how to grieve, so I just got angry." The wind stirred the leaves around her. She smiled. It felt like a nod. That afternoon she returned to her mother's church. Service was already over. The sanctuary was empty, sunlight pouring in through the stained glass windows, painting rainbows across the pews. She sat in the front row. The altar was simple, wooden, unadorned, sacred. She knelt, closed her eyes. "I still don't understand you," she whispered. "I still feel alone sometimes." She exhaled. "But I'm not angry anymore." She opened her hands. "I want to hear you again." Silence. Then, a whisper in her heart. "I never left." She wept, hard. But this time the tears weren't out of pain. They were release. On her way out, she noticed a small plaque beside the exit. It read, "He who has ears, let him hear." Matthew 11:15. She touched it gently. She was listening now. That night, she opened her journal and wrote, "I'm starting to see it now." The silence wasn't rejection. It was space. God wasn't gone. He was grieving with me. I didn't need loud miracles. I needed quiet presence. And that's what he gave me. She closed the journal and smiled. Michaela stood at the window of her apartment, wrapped in her mother's old shawl, watching the morning light spill over the skyline. It was soft and golden, like honey. The world hadn't changed. The traffic still buzzed. The clouds still rolled across the sky, the coffee shop still filled with early risers. But something in her had changed. The anger had broken, the numbness had lifted, and in its place was quiet. Not the same suffocating silence that had tormented her for weeks after the funeral. Not the vast, echoing emptiness that used to scream, "God is gone." This silence was different. It was sacred, alive, a whisper. She didn't fully understand it, but she no longer demanded to. For the first time in her life, Michaela was learning how to listen without insisting on answers. She had started waking up early, not out of obligation or insomnia, out of desire. Something about the early hours made her feel close to something eternal. She would light a candle, sit in the chair by the window, and hold her Bible. Sometimes she read, sometimes she didn't. Sometimes she just sat, and in those moments, she began to feel what her mother had written about in those journals, the God who speaks without words, the God who sits in the silence with you. One morning, as she sat in that stillness, a name floated into her mind. Rachel, her best friend in college. They hadn't spoken in 4 years, not since the fallout. Michaela had been bitter, angry, reckless with her words during a hard season. Rachel had tried to help. Michaela had shut her out. The silence between them had grown like a wall. Now, the name came back like a wind through an open door. She stared at her phone for an hour before she sent the message. "Hey, I know it's been a long time. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. You tried, I didn't. I miss you." No reply came for hours, but that afternoon, her phone buzzed. "You have no idea how much I needed to hear that today." They met for coffee. It was awkward at first. but laughter came slowly like sunrise over fog. They talked for 2 hours, then 3. And Michaela realized she wasn't the only one who had been drowning in silence. Rachel had lost her job during the pandemic, lost her mother to cancer 6 months later. She had been angry at God too. "But I think he was just waiting for me to stop performing," Rachel said quietly. "Waiting for me to finally be real." Michaela nodded. "I know the feeling." Their friendship didn't go back to what it was. It became something new, deeper, unpretending, sacred. One Sunday, Michaela found herself walking into the church again, this time during service. She hadn't planned to go, but her feet carried her there. She slipped into the back row. The worship was already in full flow, and though she didn't sing at first, she listened. The song was simple, repetitive. "I will wait for you. I will wait for you. Through the storm and through the night, I will wait for you. Surely wait for you. For your love is my delight." Michaela closed her eyes. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She mouthed the words, and for the first time, they felt like truth. After the service, she didn't rush out. She stood by the bulletin board, reading about small groups and Bible studies and local outreach. She didn't feel the same pressure to plug in like she once had. She just felt drawn. A woman beside her, older, kind eyes, gentle smile, introduced herself. Her name was June. They talked for 20 minutes, and then June said something that stuck in Michaela's chest like a note played too perfectly to ignore. "I don't know what you've been through, honey, but I can tell. God's doing something deep in you. The kind of thing you don't rush. The kind of thing that lasts." The next morning, Michaela sat with her journal. She hadn't written in it since the day she let the anger go. Now her words came not as demands, but as surrender. "God, I don't need you to explain everything. I don't need you to move fast. I just need you to stay with me. In the silence, in the stillness, in the whisper. I believe you're still here." She closed the journal and breathed deeply. She was learning how to trust without needing proof, how to rest without needing results. A week later, her cousin Ava called. She was 16, crying. "I don't know who else to call," she said. "I feel so far from everything, even God, especially God." Michaela swallowed hard. She remembered that place. She remembered it too well, so she didn't offer advice. She didn't quote a verse. She just said, "I get it, and I'm not going anywhere." They talked for hours. Later that night, Ava texted her a single line. "Thank you for not trying to fix me, just for sitting in the quiet." Transformation had come, not like thunder, but like a soft rain that soaks the ground without fanfare. It was happening in the way Michaela forgave people who never asked, in the way she started to smile at strangers again, in the way she stopped rushing through grief and started respecting it. She even picked up her mother's old cross necklace again, not because it magically fixed things, but because it reminded her that faith wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet resilience, and yet one thread still remained. Her mother's voice, her letters, her absence. There was peace now, but not closure. Michaela found herself visiting the pier again, the place they used to walk in summer. She sat on the same bench, watched the same water, and whispered, "I wish you were here to see this." The wind picked up, carried a single leaf into her lap. She didn't know why, but she took that as an answer. Not in words, but in presence, in peace. That night, Michaela opened her Bible to Psalm 34. The page felt worn from years of her mother's touch. Her eyes fell on verse 18 again. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and saves those who are crushed in spirit." She whispered the words out loud. This time they didn't sting. They held her. She was no longer angry at God. She didn't need to be. She knew now that silence wasn't distance, it was depth. The kind that doesn't need noise to be real, the kind that holds you in the dark and speaks when you're ready to hear. The sun rose gently over the city, golden light painting the streets with a softness that seemed to whisper, "You made it." Michaela stood in her kitchen, stirring a pot of oatmeal, humming an old hymn her mother used to sing when she didn't think anyone was listening. Time had passed, not in great cinematic waves, but in quiet days strung together by healing. Grief still visited her sometimes, especially in the quiet corners of her life, during morning walks, when she passed the floral shop her mother loved, or when she caught the scent of rain on pavement. But it no longer broke her. It no longer stole her breath or dragged her under. It simply came, and then went. She had learned to welcome it like an old friend. It had been 6 months since she wrote that journal entry, the one where she finally surrendered the need for answers. Since then, life had continued, not magically easier, but undeniably lighter. She joined a local women's Bible group, not because she felt obligated, but because she finally craved community again. They met every Thursday evening at June's house. June, the gentle woman she'd met in the church foyer, had become something of a spiritual mother to her. Not replacing what was lost, but helping her carry it. They would gather around mismatched mugs and tear-stained devotionals, speaking truth, praying for one another, sometimes just sitting in silence together. Michaela had shared her story one night. Not all of it, not yet, just enough to crack open the door. She spoke about her mother, her anger, the silence, the slow journey back to listening. When she finished, the room was quiet, not with awkwardness, but with awe. June had whispered, "Thank you for sharing the sacred." Soon after, Michaela was invited to speak at a local grief support group. She almost declined. She didn't consider herself healed enough. She didn't like stages or microphones or the sound of her voice, but something stirred in her chest. A whisper. So she said yes. She walked into that room 3 weeks later, heart pounding, palms sweating, holding nothing but a wrinkled page of notes and her mother's old cross necklace. She stood in front of a circle of people, some older, some younger, all carrying invisible bruises, and said, "There was a time I hated God." Heads lifted, eyes locked onto her. I begged him to speak, to move, to fix things, and all I heard was silence. For a long time, I thought that meant he didn't care. She paused. But now I know. Silence doesn't mean absence. It means he was sitting with me the whole time. She talked for 20 minutes. Afterward, 3 people hugged her. One just held her hand and cried. She didn't need to say anything more. Spring came early that year. The cold thawed sooner than expected, and Michaela found herself standing at the foot of her mother's grave on a warm April morning, daffodils dancing around the stone like sunbursts of memory. She knelt, brushing away a few fallen petals. "Hey, Mom," she whispered. The wind answered with the soft rustle of trees. "I'm okay now," she said, and she meant it. "I still miss you. That hasn't changed. But I'm not drowning anymore." She sat for a while, watched the clouds, remembered her mother's laugh, the way she used to hum when folding laundry, the creases by her eyes when she smiled. She took out a letter, one she had written the night before. "I used to think silence was abandonment, but you taught me better, even after you were gone. You taught me that God speaks in stillness, that healing isn't always loud, that some of the most powerful words are the ones we sit quietly to hear. Thank you. I'll keep listening." She left the letter at the base of the stone, weighted with a small rock. As she stood to leave, she didn't cry. She smiled. 1 month later, she sat on her porch, sipping tea with Ava, her cousin, now 17, who still wrestled with questions about faith and life and everything in between. "I still don't get it," Ava said. "Like, why doesn't God just talk to us? Why is he so quiet all the time?" Michaela smiled, looking out over the golden horizon. "Because sometimes," she said softly, "he's not waiting to talk. He's waiting for us to stop talking." Ava raised an eyebrow. "That sounds backwards." "It does," Michaela agreed. "But it's not. It's just deeper." They sat in silence for a while. Then Ava said, "You don't seem mad at him anymore." "I'm not," Michaela said. "I finally heard him." She didn't rebuild her life all at once. There were still days where loneliness knocked louder than peace. But now she answered it differently. She no longer searched the sky for lightning bolts or demanded burning bushes. She no longer waited for God to shout. She looked for Him in the pauses, in the kindness of strangers, in the quiet strength of prayer, in the silence between notes of a song. One evening, Michaela received a message from someone in the grief group. "Your story changed everything for me. I thought I was the only one angry at God. But now I think maybe He was never gone, just waiting for me to come close." Michaela replied with only a verse. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Psalm 34:18. She closed her phone and looked at her reflection in the window. She looked the same, but she knew she wasn't. And now, whenever someone asks her how she got through it, how she survived the silence, she doesn't offer a formula or a 5-step guide. She says, "I stopped shouting, and I started listening." That's when I realized he'd been whispering the whole time.